What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today my guest is Dean Radin. Dean is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, Associated Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and co-founder and vice chairman of the neuroimaging company Cognigenics. He earned an MS Electrical Engineering and a PhD Psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In 2022, he was awarded an Honorary DSc, Doctor of Science, from the Swami Vivekananda University in Bangalore, India. Before joining the IONS research staff in 2001, Radin worked at the AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He has given over 780 talks and interviews worldwide, and he is inventor of 12 patents and author or co-author of 340 plus scientific and popular articles, book chapters, and books, 4 of which have been translated into 15 foreign languages. These books are The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, Real Magic, and most recently, Science of Magic, published October 2025. In today's show, we discuss the current status of the evidence in parapsychology. Dean describes some of his experiences working at the Stargate remote viewing program for US intelligence. We talk about the challenges of designing experiments in parapsychology, and we discuss the relationship between psi phenomena and magic. I'm here with Dean Radin, and I'm sure we've got a lot to talk about over the next hour. But I'd just like to begin by saying how I first came across your work, Dean. And it was actually in 1998 when I just started a very mainstream PhD. I came across your book, The Conscious Universe, which was a summary of the working in experimental parapsychology up to that point. But let's back up a little bit. How did you become interested in psi research in the first place?
Well, if you pay attention to fiction and movies, novels, apparently everyone is interested in these topics. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a persistent trope within fiction. And so the only difference here is that I was also interested in science, and I started my career in music, so I was interested in lots of things. And one of the things I learned after my doctorate, actually even before that, was I tend to get bored pretty quickly if there's a topic that's being studied where there's already a fair amount that's already known. Because it's every discipline always has edges to it, the frontiers that are being pushed. But I wasn't attracted to places where people had a pretty good idea what was going on. I was really only attracted to places where people had no idea what was going on. And also like following William James' advice that if you pay attention to the things that don't quite fit, that's where you develop an entirely new science. That's a paraphrase of what he said. So I was attracted to anomalies because it's true that sometimes anomalies turn out to be mistakes or they can be accommodated in some way. But anomalies gave rise to modern physics in many ways, things that didn't quite fit existing theories in the late 19th century. So I was pushed by curiosity and also by finding a discipline where I have never felt bored. And it's because of this, some people feel very uncomfortable about constantly being in a state of ambiguity, but I don't. I don't mind it at all. In fact, that's why I'm not bored, because I don't actually have good answers yet. And so the second thing is that rather than simply reading the material and thinking about it and so on, you can apply scientific methods to try to wrest out of the secrets of the universe what is actually going on here. Like, is there something interesting happening? Well, I convince myself, both by reading the literature and doing experiments, that there is something interesting, and we still are very far away from a good explanation. So that's what keeps my interest.
I think that's such an important point. It's that basic curiosity about a potentially new phenomena. And I think that's a key driver for many scientists. But one of the interesting things I noticed reading through the introduction you sent me of your new book, The Science of Magic, was how many high-profile talks you'd given to places like, is it Google, and then a lot of places in, I think you mentioned the military, but also a lot of top-rate companies and universities. So do you think there's a lot of tacit interest in this topic, even if it's not sort of publicly expressed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, it's very clear that, again, the reason why these topics show up again and again in fiction is because there's something that grabs people about it. So you can take two different directions from it. One is like a standard psychological explanation that people are always interested in wishful thinking because life is uncertain and death is certain, and we're always looking for something to hold on to. So from that perspective, some of that is probably true, that we look for secret powers and that sort of thing. But I think the other part of it is that people have these experiences. It's not like if somebody was trying to push the idea that Superman was real, that's going to be a problem because there aren't too many people who have those kinds of experiences, if any. Whereas for relatively simple psychic type experiences, the surveys that ask people what they actually experience show that the majority have had these experiences, sometimes many, many times. But they learn very quickly not to talk about it because it's taboo. You're not supposed to talk about such things because apparently our textbooks don't admit that. So this is true for everyone in every domain. It's true for scientists, people in the military, people in the government, people in business, everywhere, because it's a human trait. And so when the opportunity arises to speak, to have a talk by somebody who apparently knows something about it, and for some reason, some people think I do, that I get invitations to lots and lots of places. And with sometimes audiences that I had anticipated beforehand who would be extremely critical, like so critical to the point like, why are you even inviting me to give a talk? But it turns out they're not. Because in private, even people in places you'd figure like in the military or in business, where it's standing room only. And the questions I get both during and afterwards make it very clear that people have had these same kind of experiences. And they also make it clear that they don't talk about it in public, partially because they don't want to gain the attention or they're embarrassed or something. And they feel great sense of relief to be able to talk to somebody who says, "Oh, yeah, okay, well, people do talk about that," and we even think we begin to understand why it works. And so that's why I get invited to talk to a huge range of people in different places. All the way, as I like to say, all the way from audiences full of little old ladies with blue hair to admirals and generals. I mean, it's like totally across the board.
And in fact, you begin the introduction with a discussion of when you were at the US Navy. A couple of the submarine commanders came up and told you an anecdote that's actually quite a nice illustration of the sorts of things that we're talking about, didn't they?
Yeah. So I decided to open the book with what amounts to a personal experience, which I kind of scatter through the book now. This is a little bit different than I've done in previous books. So every time I talk about some sort of scientific thing or even magical thing, I inject my own experience in it to more humanize the book. So that episode was talking to the Naval War College, which is a place that people in the Navy go to if they're on some kind of career track and they're expecting a promotion or looking for a promotion. So this particular group was called the Strategic Studies Group, which was a special group for senior officers, many of whom were on a track to be promoted to admiral. So they're in the Navy, there would be commanders or captains, and there might be colonels in the Marines and a few other branches of the military. And so the purpose of this special training was that most of them had been people in tactical positions. They were in charge of groups that were like on the front end of something. And they didn't have much training or interest in strategic thinking within the military. So this was exposing them to lots of new ideas, some of which were about strategic thinking, but also creative thinking and sort of mind expanding stuff. And they were being exposed to projects which may have been classified about upcoming weapons and threats and things like that. So anyway, so for some reason, again, they were interested in the kind of work that I do because they knew I had worked for the Stargate program before it was called
Yes.
Stargate, the U.S. government psychic spying program. So I talked about that, but in this particular episode, I was talking about the evidence for telepathy. Like, does it occur? Yes, we can see it in the laboratory. Is it electromagnetic in nature? Since we know, with EEGs, you can pick up brain waves, and maybe that's what it's doing. Probably not, because of various reasons. And so I finished that talk, and then during a break afterwards, these two submarine commanders came up and said, well, we're pretty sure it's not electromagnetic. And first of all, I didn't like, why are you even telling me this? And second, it's because both of them had independently reported that while they're under maneuvers, so they're somewhere around 300 meters below sea level or even deeper, some classified depth. When they're under maneuvers, they can stay in a nuclear sub down for months at a time. So they're down there for a long time. So one evening, and because they have their own diurnal rhythm at that point, because they're, of course, no longer on the surface. So in their evening, independently, two different sub-commanders happened to mention this to each other, which is why they even knew it happened. One of the crewmen wakes up from this vivid dream of something bad happening at home. And so they went to the commander and said, we need to surface because they have to call home because something bad is happening. Well, of course, they were reminded that under maneuvers, you can't do that. Eventually, they do rise back up to the surface. They put a buoy up, they call home. And when the sailor had that experience that indeed something bad was happening exactly as he had said. So this happened on both of the submarines. And so I asked the commanders, well, how often does this happen? Like every second Tuesday, somebody wakes up suddenly, says, we need to surface. They both said there are no false positives. It never happened other than these two instances where they were actually correct when they were able to verify later. And so the reason why they came up, it was because they said, well, there have been experiments using electromagnetically shielded chambers, but those are really only good around 10 kilohertz and above. So because otherwise very long radio waves go through everything, including seawater. But they don't work too well in seawater. When you get down to about 300 meters and below, it can penetrate. These electromagnetic frequencies that are miles long can penetrate very deep. But for a submarine to pick it up, they have to draw an antenna behind them that's a couple of miles long. And if they do pick up this signal, the amount of information that could be transferred on that channel is like 1 character per minute. So
slow.
Yeah, very, very slow, to say nothing of our brains aren't a mile long, so it would never pick it up. And even if it did pick it up, we don't have any idea about how it would decode a very rich experience that someone was having about a very specific incident that was happening in real time thousands of miles away. So that's why the commanders told me this, said, yeah, we don't think whatever's going on here, first of all, it exists, and second, it's not electromagnetic. And so, well, then what is it? Well, then we have to get into theoretical ideas. It's more about metaphysics at this point than it is about physics, at least today's physics. Well, and that requires a discussion about philosophy, which generally and surprisingly does come up. Like worldview issues come up even in these kinds of contexts. So I was actually, having done a number of talks to people in different branches of the military, usually, in fact, always at high officer levels, I was really impressed with these folks. Besides what they were doing as part of their job, they were very well read, very intelligent. I mean, in a sense, they had to be, otherwise they wouldn't have gotten to where they got to. In addition, unlike what I originally thought, that they'd be very skeptical about this, because the military also tends to be very pragmatic. By the time somebody gets to an officer level, they're very open to the idea that intuition is more than simply guessing, because they wouldn't be there, especially if they've been in combat. They know that their intuition was important for their own life and for the people that were serving under them. If they made the wrong decision too many times, they got a lot of people killed. So the people who tend to rise through the ranks get very, very good at this because they had to.
Absolutely. And what I like about this account especially is it recalls what Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer, I think, called extraordinary knowing, which is like you've got some information from somewhere. So it might be from a distance, perhaps from another mind, perhaps from the future. So I did a small survey for the Society for Psychical Research, which I talk about in my book. And I got a couple of quite strong apparent precognition experiences. So from the future, there was one that there was a very strong precognition of the Dunblane shooting, which was this terrible shooting in the UK, but a very strong, it went way beyond chance. And I think that's what you're saying is quite often with the skeptical commentary, we write this stuff off. But I'd like to ask you a little bit more about Stargate, because I think that's a nice segue into the experimental work. So just explain a tiny bit about Stargate, and if you can, what kind of work did you do with that program?
Well, I was a visiting scientist for 1 year. I was working at Bell Laboratories at the time, and I took a 1-year leave of absence. And so for the calendar year 1985, I was on a program. The code name was Grill Flame. That's what it was back then. It was an Army program. So the program from the very beginning was sparked by people in the intelligence and the military world for reasons that we just discussed. They're very well aware that things like this happen. And then the question is, well, could it be useful in some way? Especially within intelligence, and especially if clairvoyance is real. So it was renamed remote viewing to make a euphemism that didn't sound spooky. And also Ingo Swann developed a training program. And so that remote viewing is associated now with a specific kind of training for teaching people how to do clairvoyance. And a lot of people, of course, have now taken that training. Some turn out to be quite good at it. And there's a million different variations of it now as each new generation comes along and develops their own name for the type of training that they do. Well, so in the beginning stages, though, the initial studies before I went on the program were partially related to threat analysis. Like we hear stories from Russia or China or somewhere else that they're doing something in this domain, and do we need to worry about it? So that's where the threat analysis comes from. And sometimes that it only entails reading articles that have been published in other journals. Sometimes we get it surreptitiously somehow, and we look at it and say, well, is this report reasonable? Sometimes it obviously wasn't. Other times we weren't quite so sure, so there may have been experiments done to see if we could replicate what was being reported by these other folks. And then by the time I got there, a lot of it was already about use of remote viewing for intelligence purposes. And they had a number of extremely adept people doing that kind of work already on missions. My side was on the research, so we were more interested in, well, how does this stuff work? How do we make it better? How do we identify people who have talent? And so that was really where most of it was about. How do we first of all convince ourselves that it really is a real thing? And so that was easy to do. How do we make better methods of testing? And then again, how do we identify people who have the talent, like a priori? Because the easy way to identify talent in any domain is give somebody a task that requires that skill. Some people will do it good and some won't do so good. And that's pretty much what was done in those cases with very few questions. Like, have you ever had a psychic experience? You just see, how does the person respond to that? If they screw up their face and walk away, you know that they don't want to have anything to do with this. If they look thoughtful and say, well, yeah, this or that happened to me and, you know, it runs in my family, and you start hearing those kinds of things that we know are associated with these experiences, and you say, okay, well, why don't you try these various tests? And that's how you find people with talent. You just search for them.
In one of your books, Entangled Minds, you actually discuss a little bit of some of the grill flame, some very spectacular hits. And I was also reading Russell Targ's book on the remote viewing. And I think people don't understand just how precise some of the hits were. So one of the times I think the remote viewer was actually guessing secret code words inside a locked filing cabinet. You know, so we're talking way beyond chance here, aren't we?
Well, not only beyond chance. I mean, first of all, in that particular case, that was Pat Price who was doing this, I think. That ended up with a congressional hearing because people assumed that there must have been a leak somewhere because the target was not a secret facility. It was something else. It was like a cabin in the woods somewhere, but over the mountain, there happened to be the secret facility, which was more interesting to the psychic eye. And so the remote viewer saw that other facility, went there, went inside a building, saw a safe, went inside the safe, read the code words. That's no longer in the realm of, is it a p-value of 0.05? It's gaining actual verifiable information. And that's why I believe that Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ ended up in Congress at a secret hearing saying there's some major leak somewhere, because that was clearly impossible. But it wasn't. So some people can do that. And that is one of the reasons why that program continued, because people who are aware of it, and I think there's a parallel today with UFOs. So lots of stories about UFOs, about contact, about bodies, who knows, behind closed doors in secret congressional hearings. Some of the congressional representatives and maybe people in the military and so on, they hear things which makes their brains blow up. I mean, they're really mind-boggling stuff, which is so far sort of public, but not quite yet. But like, we don't have any of the details, but apparently there are details. So you can imagine in a behind closed doors classified setting that you're hearing that there are some people who have the capacity to be able to go into closed buildings that we are not even telling you about and finding code words inside safes. Well, as an intelligence analyst, you're thinking, well, that's not good. How do we protect against that? And among other things,
because the enemy could be doing it.
Well, not only are other people probably doing it, but can we block it? Can we prevent that from happening? And the answer probably is no. We don't have any idea about how to block it. So that was yet another thing that would come up occasionally in the Stargate program. We know we can do this, we were sure that the Russians, at least, were doing the same thing, and later that was confirmed they were. How do we protect information? If there's a method, and so this is one of the reasons why I always felt a little odd working on that program. It was a highly classified program which is designed to keep secrets. But the purpose of the program was to reveal secrets. And so, if you're thinking that, it seems very strange that it's a secret program about revealing secrets. I mean, it's just kind of a strange irony. Anyway, so there probably are ways of you can't completely shield. You can't put a code word in something and then they can't get through it like lead. So Superman can't see through lead, I guess. But he could melt it. So I don't know why lead would be a thing. Anyway, what you would do is use camouflage. And it goes back to that story of here's a target, which is a little cabin in the middle of the woods somewhere. Well, that's not very interesting. Oh, but I see over that mountain there's something really interesting. So that's either camouflage or deflection, because even very talented people don't have that good control over what the psychic eye is going to look at. And so if you have a secret over here and you have something that is way more shiny and interesting right next to it, they might miss this. So it's kind of a psychic camouflage. So that appears that maybe something like that would work.
Oh, right. The conversation we're having is so, I've had conversation with skeptics over the years and once or twice on this podcast. And the conversation we're having is so far beyond the sorts of discussions where we're still arguing about things like basic replication, which I hope we'll discuss in a moment. But one of the things I liked about your first two books in particular, The Conscious Universe and Entangled Minds, was they were obviously an attempted summary of the experimental evidence for parapsychology. So you were looking at it's mainly statistical evidence, so meta-analyses, lots of these. So we have in parapsychology a number of experimental protocols like the Gansfeld remote viewing we've mentioned. There are things like presentiment and other things as well. So I really wanted to ask you, Dean, what is your opinion of the current status of the evidence in parapsychology? Are we going to hear a little bit about that in your latest book as well?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the whole second section is bringing the evidence up to date. So the 2018 article in American Psychologist by Etzel Cardinho was a very good summary at that time. So we had something like 10 or 11 meta-analyses. Overall, using the same methods that they're used in other disciplines, it's pretty clear that there's a real repeatable effect. One of the things that I do talk about in the new book is something I see happen a lot, which is a conflation and misunderstanding of efficacy versus existence. So the existence efficacy seesaw there is that we say, yes, we do see real effects. They tend to be pretty small. But it's all about the question of existence. Does this thing exist? Whereas for people who don't have a good feeling about statistics, they would say, well, why would I care about something that's 1% or 0.1%? Like, who cares? Well, we care because it exists. Well, how do you know it exists? Well, you need to understand statistics, because if you have a 10 sigma result or something after you do X number of replications, you have very, very high confidence that it exists. A lot of people don't even understand that. So the way that I then talk about it in the book is, we know through lots of measurements that the charge on a single electron is really tiny. It's a real charge. It's really tiny. And so if we stopped experiments at the point where we said, well, who cares if you have like 1 gazillionth of a piece of charge in this little particle? What difference does it make? Well, the world runs on electricity now because we figured it out. And so by the same reason, yes, what we see in the laboratory is kind of a pale reflection of what happens in the real world with normal people. But when you have especially highly motivated, talented people, you get much, much bigger effects, which gives us an idea about what kind of limits are we dealing with here. And when you see that, you begin to recognize that even with tiny little trickle psi effects, as we understand it more, maybe the future world will run on psi, because we understand it. So, we're at the stage of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite and studying sparks that happen. Well, that's where we are. So the idea then that everything has to be monstrous and obvious before you accept it makes sense from the average person's point of view, but from a scientific point of view, it's completely irrelevant. And so I ask AI occasionally, like, what do you think? What do you think of this parapsychology thing? Is there any evidence there? It always comes back the same way because everything it learned from Wikipedia. So it learned that no, there's methodological flaws and there's this and that, and I challenge it. And within 5 or 6 prompts, I can get it to completely reverse. Once I say, well, what flaws? Tell me what flaws in particular. And also, it says, well, it's such a small effect, who cares? And I say this whole existence versus efficacy thing. It's easy to change the AI's, quote, mind because it's pulling off the top of what it has learned. But as soon as you point it to things that counter that, it changes its response immediately. So that's why the skeptical arguments, especially as revealed by the argument in response to Edsel Cardinho's article in 2018. So in 2020, yes. 2 skeptics wrote this article, also an American psychologist, and finally they admitted what is the current skeptical position, which is the results are impossible, so we don't need to address the evidence. That's not a scientific argument anymore. I don't know what kind of argument it is, but it's not scientific. And if that is considered the current state of skepticism, where you don't even bother to address the evidence because you're already convinced that it's impossible, well, all I can do with that is shrug and say, okay, I guess if you want to be willfully ignorant, you can do that. Yeah, that's okay. But then why was it published? Why would an editor publish an article in presumably a scientific journal that was not a scientific argument? I don't get it.
Yes, that was the James Alcock and Reba paper. So Alcock's a veteran, he's a psychologist and a veteran skeptic. And I remember I'll link all this in the show notes, but there was a big discussion about that in the Journal of Scientific Exploration as well, saying who gets to decide what's possible and impossible. But in terms of skepticism, I think the skeptic, I have a lot of respect for Chris French, who's a UK skeptic, and it's partly because he's actually done experiments himself. And that I had him on the show, and he was saying, well, we can't get replications. And in his writing, and this I particularly wanted to ask you about this, there was a 2022 Transparent Psi project, which was absolutely enormous, that failed to replicate, I think it was a precognitive effect that Darrell Bemmerd reported. So I'd really like to ask you what your thoughts were on that and on the replication issue, Ray skeptics more generally.
Yeah, so the trend, because of the so-called replication crisis, which, by the way, is not just in psychology or parapsychology, it's in every discipline, including physics. It's simply difficult to replicate things, sometimes because there's tacit knowledge that's involved in doing the experiment, which is, by being tacit, means it doesn't show up in publications because maybe even the experimenters don't know why it works. So that's part of it. The other part, though, especially for psi research, and of course, you have to keep in mind immediately also that even standard psychological tests are not easy to replicate. That's the whole reason why meta-analysis was developed. So there may be something peculiar, especially peculiar in psi research, because if you accept that the hypothesis is true, that there's extended mind, there are intentions that play with the way things happen, then for exactly the same reason why in the magical traditions, I'm talking about sorcerers primarily, their work is always completely secret. And the reason is that if you hold this idea that intention matters in some way, then the moment that you do an experiment, but you make it completely transparent, so like a lot of intentions are involved now in this mix, that is the equivalent of a dirty test tube if you're doing a biological experiment. So why would you want to do that? I don't want to do that. If I'm doing an experiment, especially involving one that involves intention in some way, like a psychokinetic effect, I'm not going to let anybody know. certainly not going to like reveal everything at the very beginning, because that is the dirty test tube. It's confounding the effect that you wish to study with a potentially huge number of other intentions. Now, that doesn't mean you can't pre-register it and you can do all of the usual things that we do now, but it does mean that you need to be extremely careful about how you open this particular box. Now, if it turns out that the phenomena doesn't exist, and you can create a very clean separation, so you can have true controls and true double blinds and so on, then yeah, it should work. But given all of the previous data that we have, smaller scale experiments that are meta-analyzed, I think it's pretty clear that our epistemologies are not adequate to be able to study psi in the same way that you would study something like a very robust effect like the Stroop effect or something like that. So anytime you start approaching any sort of more subtle effect, especially psychological effect, there will be difficulties in replicating. And I think a lot of the difficulties within standard psychological tests actually are because of psi effects that are not being looked at. But I can easily imagine that if you bring somebody into the lab to do some sort of EEG test or evoked response or whatever, like, why do you need to take hundreds and hundreds of evoked responses in an EEG? Why not just take one? If it's real, do one. Well, it doesn't work that way because some things are stochastic and some things don't work every single time. So it's not surprising to me that most of the large-scale multi-center studies simply don't work. It adds so much additional noise to the experiment that it becomes difficult to work, more difficult than usual. And as we know, even the best laid plans and the best laboratories with the best people and all the rest of it, it still doesn't work every single time because maybe the geomagnetic field was operating badly, or there, lots of other environmental effects can influence the way that these phenomena work. So that's why those skeptical arguments don't impress me at all.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair enough, actually. A couple of things. I mean, firstly, I've long thought that as soon as you get consciousness involved, it kind of shifts the playing field. The second thing is I'm thinking of, there's a philosopher, Stephen Browdy, who's talked a lot about these sorts of issues, replication issues. He talks about the source of psi problem. So if psi does what we think it does, which is sort of all pervasive and we all kind of admit it, then we don't know where the psi comes from that creates extra chance results. So it might come from an experiment or it might come from the experimentee. At this state of our knowledge, we just don't know. Would you still say that's still a fair argument?
Yeah. And it might even come from the future. It might come from the past. It might come from the way the sun is behaving, right? So we don't know yet. But again, that for me, that's the exciting part of it, right? We get reasonably high confidence that the phenomena exist. It's repeated endlessly in human experiences. We even see it in a laboratory. So it suggests some sort of interconnectedness having to do with the way mind interacts with the physical world. And I find that fascinating. That changes our worldview about what kind of an existence do we think we are in. And so what could be more interesting than that? Well, so that's why, do we just give up at some point because we're not clever enough to figure it out? No. We keep pushing the envelope as best as we can, and eventually somebody will come along with a clever idea and come up with a new type of experiment to begin to at least narrow how much or at least identify where the source of psi is. So I'll give an example here. So one of the things that occasionally comes up, especially given that the nature of consciousness is now reasonably well recognized, that it's not limited to humans. So animals, insects, plants, I mean, there's evidence across the board that every sentient living creature is reactive in some way to their environment and can change behavior and sometimes show memory and so on. Okay, so what about plant PK? So this is not, I'm going to think that I want this plant to grow better, so it grows better, but rather have the plant influence a random generator to give it water or light. So you take a plant and you put it in a dark closet, but it has a grow light and it has a water pump, and it can get what it wants essentially by influencing the random generator. So one of the problems with that design is that, well, some person has to put that thing together, and so maybe they're the ones who are doing it. And so I thought, well, why don't we actually have a way of measuring what the plant wants? And so there are various kinds of measurements you can put on a leaf and you can put in the soil, and you can then infer based on the leaves when they begin to droop, or the soil begins to get too dry. And also you can test whether or not the plant wants light by looking at chlorophyll fluorescence. You get a lot of measures that you can have that are more or less continuous, and you'll be able to then infer that when the plant thinks that it needs light, like if it's going through a diurnal rhythm and expecting the sun to come up, well, if that's when the random generator starts doing its thing, that is now suggesting it maybe really is the plant, because after all, I, as the experimenter, I put it in a closet for a month and I don't look at it for a month. And I come back later and say, oh, the generator has some kind of diurnal rhythm in it, which is corresponding to what it normally would want as light. And the water as well, because we have ways of testing when the plant starts drooping, it doesn't have enough water. And other measures like that too. So if we can correlate the intention of the plant, which is our inference based on those measurements, that's one step away now from the experimenter, partially because it's behind closed doors. And yes, the experimenter can have clairvoyance, and maybe they're unconsciously wanting the plant to live. I don't know how we get rid of that at all, except that you get people who, you put one of these in Chris French's lab, and you get somebody else who thinks this is complete nonsense, and so on. You'd put this in different kinds of contexts, and just run the same experiment with the same kind of plant and the same kind of equipment and see what happens.
So I'm presuming you haven't actually tried this out yet, or have you?
No, I'm at the design stage at this point. The tricky bit is not the plant and it's not the random generators. It's the measurements. So the measurements are available, but they're very, very expensive because they're mainly for plant physiology. And so there are some companies that sell these things, but they're like crazy expensive. So there have the beginnings of people, like grad students, who say, I can't afford $15,000 to measure the whether a plant leaf droops using this thing that his company makes. So I'll make a version of myself, a do-it-yourself thing. So now it costs $200. So I've been looking at equipment to be able to make the entire replication package, essentially, for a few $100s. And I think it's possible. Microcontroller controlled thing that has I already built something that has a pump that can pump liquid controlled by a microcontroller, which in turn could be monitoring a random generator for a different experiment. So I think you could probably make this for a few $100s. And then, go to citizen science and say, well, for $200, you too can test to see whether your plants are aware. I think it's both interesting from the point of view that we know people like to do experiments and they can't spend a lot of money on it. This would be a way that the general public at large, to say nothing of our own colleagues, can do experiments like this and even use the apparatus for other kinds of targets, like different kinds of plants. So I'm thinking, well, like for a cactus, it may not work so well because it could live pretty nicely for a long time without any water and might not need much light. But take a very sensitive plant like I think a mimosa plant. The sensitive plants that you just get near and touch it and the whole thing folds up. Well, try it with that plant. So try it essentially with different plant equivalents of human sensitivities. You take like a meathead type of fighter person who's like a muscle man, they are very different physiologically than somebody who's extremely sensitive. Do they respond differently for psi tests? Maybe, but I don't know if anybody's ever tried that before. There's something like the way you are embodied that interacts with psi. I suspect yes, but again, I don't know. But it would be easier to do that with something like plants. And also, I don't think you need an IRB for plants. Now, maybe, I don't think so. I know for animals you do. The animal equivalent of an IRB. But for plants, I don't think we need that yet.
Mm. Yes, it would be easier. I mean, I think what you're saying is there's a lot of stuff, experiments that need to be done that haven't been done yet, partly because the funding hasn't been there. But I'd like to again swivel a little bit to your last couple of books, because we've discussed experimental parapsychology in the sort of very academia, sort of science-based context. But your last couple of books, Real Magic, and then the latest one that is just coming out, actually, The Science of Magic, you explicitly shift to looking at it in the context of sort of what we might call Western esoteric practice or Western occultism. So can you tell me a little bit about why that shift happened and why that's significant?
Well, everyone involved in parapsychology, I think, has known forever that one of the reasons why the topic is considered taboo in the academic world is because it is that close to occultism. And so there is both scientific and religious pressure to not go there. And so in order to give the impression that there's an analogy here with the way academic psychology works, but we give the impression that we're serious scientists, we do laboratory work, we're not interested in this occult nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And it's a matter of sociological credibility. Psychology went through the same thing, like back in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, when people like B.F. Skinner came along and said, if we want psychology to be taken seriously as a science, we can't talk about subjective something or other going on inside your head. We can only talk about behavior. So behaviorism came along, and eventually, because everything was only based on what you could observe externally, the idea that people had subjective experience kind of went away. Like the idea that people are conscious and had consciousness was considered not only irrelevant, but not existent anymore, illusory. And there are people still today, who think that there really is no consciousness. It's just like, I don't know what it is, but it's not there somehow. So as long as I've been involved in the field, and I can see also from literature before I came into the field in around 1980 or so, everybody knew that what we're studying ultimately would be considered shamanism or magic or occult ideas and so on, but we just don't talk about it. Well, I got tired of that, because it's pretty clear to me that that is exactly what we're studying. We're studying what in previous times would have been called magic. Different cultures, different language, different practices. Magic tends to be more pragmatic than the kind of work that we're doing. But the phenomena are the same. And so I'm giving a talk at Harvard Medical School next week. And I wanted to say, well, can I talk about my new book? It has the word magic in it. So I was advised that probably it's not a good idea to use the word magic, because it would cause panic. Like you're in Harvard here. You're not supposed to talk about magic. Scientific panic would ensue and people would go crazy. So that's why we use euphemisms, right? I can talk about informational anomalies. I can talk about the labels that we use for these phenomena, but ultimately it's about experience. As it turns out, I will be talking about magic, but I'm going to frame it in terms of the ancient folklore that you see reflected in virtually every major religion and shamanism and everywhere else. That the reason why that's interesting, even to talk about from like religious studies perspective, isn't it interesting in lots of different cultures? The people who are talking about a series of special siddhis or iddhis or the karamats or the charisms, that every version of metaphysics that has been developed listed that some people sometimes would either get or be anointed with, or for whatever reason, the whole range of phenomena that today we call psi. The way that they would talk about it is the same problem with hagiography, where the lives of the saints suddenly become amazingly good because they're embellished over time. So it's not surprising that we see embellishments even in the stories about the various siddhis that the yogis would talk about. It's not simply the first couple of siddhis are elementary psi stuff, precognition, clairvoyance, and so on. And then you can gain the weight of an elephant, and then you can fly, and then you can do all these other things. maybe that's true and maybe not, because we haven't been able to test any of those yet. But maybe in another culture, different time, different place, lack of distraction by TikTok, maybe some people could do that. So, it's possible, even though we don't know how. So that's why I talk about magic as a way of, and especially science of magic now in this new book, because the whole history of science has been to look at things that were considered magical or supernatural because we didn't know what else to call it. And then we got new language and new ways of looking at it, and it was no longer magic. Now it's called pharmaceuticals. It used to be called magic, and now it's called looking at the planets. It used to be something completely different. So every time we extended our senses with instruments, whole new realms of reality open up. And that gives rise to language, concepts, theories, and so on. That, I believe, is what's happening with magic. It's not going to happen next Tuesday, but when you look at the trend of where we're going, I think we're inevitably going to end up there.
No, I was going to say it will be sort of rebranded, won't it? I'm very much looking forward to reading that. Actually, it's especially the updates for the data, because I think to me it's still a little bit of an uphill struggle convincing people who aren't in the field that this is actually not just a going concern, but actually, I think, an integral part of consciousness studies. Yeah. But one thing that I find encouraging is this shift in consciousness studies away from materialism being the only game in town. So you actually, at the beginning of your book, you quote Richard Dawkins endorsing the possibility that the mind might be more than consciousness might be more than the brain. I found that extraordinary.
Yeah, it's very, very unexpected. In a YouTube interview, I don't remember, I mentioned in the book, but I don't remember at the moment who that was, where he's talking about the nature of memory and awareness, essentially, and saying, well, it's not in here, it's in the cloud. Which I think, what? That's Dawkins saying that? I mean, and it had to do with him demonstrating to his mother at the time, who was still alive. She was amazed that you could play any song on a phone. Well, how does all that fit in there? Where are those people at? A radio or something? No, it's in the cloud. And he then uses that as a metaphor for things like memory and awareness and consciousness. And I think, well, that doesn't sound like something a hardcore materialist would say. It sounds much more like somebody who is open to the idea that there's something like a non-local form of consciousness, because ultimately that's kind of what all of Psi is pointing at, is something like that. That there's either consciousness pervading everything, or it's non-local in some form, or it's quantum, blah blah, or something like that.
Yes, it's fascinating. One of my previous guests has done a lot of work on the philosophy of non-duality, and he suggests that one of the fundamental principle of that is essentially everything is unified, and that means, by implication, the dissolution of time and space. And when he started talking like that, I thought of psi phenomena, because that almost predicts something like psi, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. One of the things I mentioned in the book is one of the ways that we know that the scientific paradigm as a whole is beginning to change is to look at the way that consciousness studies has changed in the last 30 years or so. So 30 years ago, if you told somebody I'm studying consciousness, they'd look at you with a blank stare saying, I don't even know what that means. Because only philosophers were interested in consciousness studies, and a small band of philosophers, mind-body, and anesthesiologists. That's the only people who even thought about it. Today, this latest review of the landscape of consciousness, this paper that was written by Robert Kuhn, and now the accompanying website, there's something like 320 different theories of consciousness, half of which are materialistic, half of which are not. And even among the non-materialistic versions, there's now a stripe of so-called anomalous ideas about consciousness, altered states and anomalies, which is basically psi, things like that. So it's not this, the point of that landscape was not to say we think this is the answer, but rather this is now the landscape that is being discussed, and it's taken seriously, which is
Yes.
that's new. That's a completely new thing, and the fact that half of the theories are no longer materialistic. The moment you get into a non-physical or non-materialistic theory of consciousness, within those theories, psi is much, much more plausible. And if you get, of course, you go down to all the way down to something like analytical idealism, psi must occur. And in fact, any form of idealism, or even dual aspect monism, or panpsychism, all of those theories, plus a whole bunch of others, it's not only that psi would be plausible, but that it could be predicted, that this has to occur at some level.
Yes, I mean, for me, I've been fascinated to see how the landscape shifted since I did my PhD, actually. This is almost 25 years ago now, and teaching consciousness studies the last 6 years, having to keep up with it. And even in the last 3 or 4 years, I've noticed that shift. And I have to say, I think thinkers like Bernardo Kastrup have been very crucial, because he in particular has provided a framework for idealism. And if idealism like 20 years ago would not have been part of the scientific, any kind of serious academic consideration.
However, all of the founders, I think with one exception, of quantum mechanics were idealists, right? I mean, we were all familiar with Max Planck and what he said, but everyone else, or almost everyone else, came from the German idealist school. This is why they were saying consciousness is fundamental. That did not stop them from creating the most refined physical theory that we know. And that's one of the reasons why they, and including up to physicists of the present day, they were very, very interested in the role of consciousness in the physical world. I mean, von Neumann probably he sort of narrowed it down into consciousness collapsing the wave function, but all of them had written extensively on this and thought about it deeply. And as I said, even people today like Zeilinger, who got the Nobel Prize a few years ago, he writes about this. I mean, Giesen does, and I mean, leading physicists who really have thought deeply about not so much the mechanics, like the mathematics of how do you use this, but thinking about the interpretation of it, as Einstein was concerned about this too. What in the world does this theory mean in terms of our understanding of who and what we are and of physical world and mind and whatever? If you really start have a half of a bone of philosophical sense when you're thinking about a physical theory, you would say, well, how do I interpret this? What does this mean for our sense of reality? Very often will lead you directly into the question of, well, exactly what is measurement? What does it mean for something to be measured? And when you go down that path, if you go far enough, you end up with idealism. So people ask me then, well, what is my metaphysic then in terms of thinking about all this? And my answer there is that I'm an idealist every second Tuesday. And about every second or third Thursday, I become a panpsychist. Then most of the time, I'm kind of somewhere between a dual aspect monist and a materialist. And the reason I add the last bit is because the epistemologies that I use in order to do experiments are almost completely based on materialism, right? If I'm going to use something with a double blind or a control or whatever, that is materialistic idea. And the reason why I use it is because I don't know what else to use. Give somebody who's an idealist, give me a proper scientific way of studying something from an idealist framework, and I will use that. I haven't heard anything yet.
I think that's an important point, and I like to think of these different perspectives actually as partial truths. And you mentioned thinking of them as a special case. So it's Newtonian mechanics works within a certain context, but at a certain point it breaks down. So maybe we don't have to have one single final metaphysic. Maybe it's more like that there are complementary ways of looking at reality.
Makes things complicated, doesn't it?
Very. We're coming to the end of our time. So, Dean, what are you working on at the moment? And could you say a little bit about your hopes for the immediate future for psi research and consciousness studies?
Well, what I'm working on at the moment, I have a half a dozen things happening all at once. Well, one I'll mention is that I will soon launch a website which is continuing my line of research, looking at how mind interacts with photons. And so the website is a portal which connects to a diffraction system, an interference system, which is on a table behind me here. And so in the website, that looks sort of like an adventure game intentionally. You go into these spaces which kind of look like this forest here, and you come up to a candle flame, and your task is to make the candle flame get dimmer and dimmer intentionally. And as you do that, a little secret word becomes brighter and brighter, and then you can see what the secret word is. So for 30 seconds, that's your task. Make this dim, make the word come up, and then at the end of 30 seconds, you're asked, well, what is the secret word? And you have 4 possibilities. So that's a kind of a way of making sure that people are paying attention to the task, because otherwise, if they get it wrong or they don't get it at all, they're probably not paying attention, and I use that then as to regress it out of the results. So what that is linked to is a spot of light in the interferometer. And so it's related again to the collapse of the wave function. So that spot of light only exists because of wave interference. And so if you're paying very close attention to that spot by association back from the candle flame to the apparatus, then your attention, your awareness of it should cause the light to go away. You're collapsing the waves. So the amount of light would go away and the candle goes down. So that's the basic idea. So it's a 10-minute test where you go through 30-second periods where you're trying to make the candle change, and then you answer the answer for the secret word, and you go back and forth a couple times, and then it's 10 minutes, and that's the end of it. So it looks like a game to not have to explain the technical details of how is it that this is connected to the interferometer and all of that stuff. But ultimately, it's a replication of a study I published the beginning of this year, in which I made little interferometers and actually sent it to people who we had vetted as maybe having some talent. And so it's a replication of that, but it's much easier because now I only had to make one interferometer that was at the really, really good interferometer, and the portal will be through the web. So that's one of many things I'm doing.
Oh, brilliant. So anyone will be able to interact with that. Yes, I'd like to have a go with that. That sounds interesting. So what are your hopes for the immediate future? Do you think the skeptics are going to get to admit defeat, or
Skeptics will never admit defeat because they have an a priori expectation, and as we all know, your expectations allow you to see what you see. So if your belief or expectations is this stuff is nonsense, that's what you're going to see. It doesn't matter. Even if you have a personal experience, it'll be interpreted in that way. So that's not going to change. As Max Planck said, that science advances by funerals. That's what's going to happen here as well. It's true across the board in science. We're going to see it in parapsychology because that's what I'm most aware of. But you find historical examples of that again and again. That's just the way it works. Mm-hmm. So I think the reason why I'm optimistic is mainly because that the notion that you can now talk about consciousness in a serious way in a lot of contexts, and vastly increased interest within Silicon Valley. And the reason for that, I think, is because a lot of people in Silicon Valley are either microdosing with psychedelics or have taken, they take it a lot. Their minds are getting blown with experiences. And I often hear them, they say, well, we're fascinated. These are very wealthy, very highly placed people in Silicon Valley who want to talk to me. They're holding their own conferences. They're looking at how does technology interact with this. There are specialized groups within Silicon Valley that are now looking at consciousness hacking, so-called. Special meetings are being planned. I mean, the interest of course, interest that is driven by the general public has always been there. That's simply there. It's like in the background. We're now talking about people who can make a difference, mainly because they're interested and they have money to spend. And so I'm asked sometimes, well, what if you had the infinite amount of money, what would you do with it? Well, I have a whole bunch of experiments in mind, but I would also do what was done at the University of Edinburgh. I would create endowed chairs at universities all over the place and train thousands of people who are interested in this, what the history is and what the methods are and the outstanding problems and all the rest of it. Because there may be 100, 200 academics who are actively engaged in these kinds of topics, and we're making progress, but it's exceedingly slow. And it could be accelerated extremely fast, especially now giving like a widespread, more opening to these kinds of topics if we had thousands of people and more money simply to use to study these things.
Yeah, yes, and there's so much new technology come online, not only in neuroscience but also in AI. So I think a precognition study that actually I think Chris French collaborated with, they were using machine learning to look at patterns in in sort of the responses for precognition experiments, and I think that may be the way to go, because if it's subtle, then we need to be using machines that can find subtle patterns, and AI can be pretty good at that. So, well, it's such an exciting time, not only for parapsychology, but for consciousness studies more broadly. And, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to and hearing your opinion on various things, Dean. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Thank you. What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coben. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coben, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.